Welcome everybody. If you could take your places, have a seat at your tables with your coffee and your little munchies, that's great. You're very welcome. The new people, some students moving in and out from class, so this is our annual conference on the integrity of creation that celebrates the spirit and mission of the university. The conference topic this year is on the Global Sustainability Challenge. There are books of our previous conferences on the back table that you'll be able to see what we're doing. We publish the papers from each conference annually. And over here on the right-hand side, on the other side of this divider, is a series of poster presentations. So I encourage you after the presentation and over lunch to maybe go in and have a look at those. So we've had two fabulous presentations so far. We have this next presentation and then we have a lunch break. So it's my honor to introduce the Department Chair of Theology, Marinis, who's going to introduce our speaker. Marinis.
Good morning. My job is going to be brief. Well, hopefully it's going to be brief, but when you are introducing a big and renowned scholar, you be patient with what you get. Mary Evelyn Tucker is a senior lecturer and research scholar at Yale University, where she has appointments in the School of Forestry and Environmental Studies, as well as the Divinity School and the Department of Religious Studies. She teaches in the joint MA program in Religion and Ecology and directs the Forum on Religion and Ecology at Yale with her husband, John Green. Her special area of study is Asian religions. She received her PhD from Columbia University in Japanese Confucianism. Since 1997, she has been a research associate at the Reischauer Institute of Japanese Studies at Harvard. Her Confucian publications include Moral and Spiritual Cultivation in Japanese Neo-Confucianism, 1989, and The Philosophy of Qi in Columbia Press, 2007. With Tu Weiming, she edited 2 volumes on Confucian spirituality with Crossroads, 2003 and 2004. Her concern for the growing environmental crisis, especially in Asia, led her to organize with John Green a series of 10 conferences on world religions and ecology at the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard from 1995 to 1998. Together, they are series editors for the 10 volumes from the conferences distributed by Harvard University Press. And in this series, she co-edited Buddhism and Ecology in 1997, Confucianism and Ecology in 1998, and Hinduism and Ecology in 2000. The conference series, she and her husband founded the Forum on Religion and Ecology at a culminating conference at the United Nations in 1998. They now direct the forum at Yale, where they also teach religion and ecology. Tucker and Grimm studied world religions with Thomas Berry in graduate school and worked closely with him for 30 years. They are the managing trustees of the Thomas Berry Foundation. She edited several of Berry's books. Tucker and Grimm have spoken and written extensively about the papal encyclical on the environment titled Laudato Si. She especially the article Integrating Ecology and Justice and the papal encyclical in the Quarterly Review of Biology in September 2016. She has been involved with the Earth Charter since its inception. She served on the International Earth Charter Drafting Committee from 1997 to 2000 and was a member of the Earth Charter International Council. She also serves on the advisory boards of Orion Magazine and the Garrison Institute and Greenbelt Movement in the United States. This morning, the topic of our paper is Environmental Ethics of China, However, she's going to start with some slides that will kind of lay the foundations on her topic, and the slides will focus on ecology and religion. Please join me to welcome Dr. Mary Evelyn Tucker.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and certainly thanks to Jerry, his assistant Gloria, some of the faculty who've been involved with this, Dan Scheid and others. I'm most grateful to be here, and especially for the students who've joined us as well. I look forward to talking with some of you at lunch. I'm going to do these slides at the beginning to just give you a sense of the larger body of work that was so kindly mentioned here in the introduction, and then focus on China in particular. When we're talking about leveraging change for climate change, the climate science is not communicating in this country, as we know. It's communicating in other parts of the world, but climate policy is clearly deadlocked. And we're talking about major issues, major problems. What is needed besides science and policy, economics, law, technology? What's needed is the kinds of things that Duquesne can contribute, or theology and philosophy departments can contribute, namely a sense of world cultures and religions, values for change. We've also done a large project called Journey of the Universe, which is a film that was on PBS for 3 years, won an Emmy, and that's telling the story from a Teilhard de Chardin and Thomas Berry perspective of awakening awe and wonder and beauty for how we're part of a 14 billion year universe. I won't talk about that part of our project, but I'm happy to leave the link to watch the film and conversations and so on. So we're saying awe and wonder, values, clearly from our presentation this morning, guilt and terror. All of these are part of what's awakening change at this moment in human history, this Anthropocene. So broad spiritual sensibilities beyond religion are also important, as we know, because there are many ways of valuing nature, and it's why Jennifer Bates's work in the philosophy of nature and philosophy and ecology are important. Secular approaches from environmental ethics, from philosophy, or environmental action that are very pragmatic, as Sarah mentioned. So Aldo Leopold, for example, a graduate of our school at Yale School of the Environment, was one of the first to say we need a land ethics. We need something that will bring beyond the human a sense that we're part of a biotic community. And I strongly recommend his book, Sand County Almanac. To the extension of ethics beyond the human in this land ethic, he said, preserves the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. And he said, this ethics is an evolutionary possibility and an ecological necessity. And that is our challenge. The next generation gets this immediately. Of course we need an ethics for the environment. How are we going to speak about life, the life force, the life communities? So religions, too, are entering into this discussion. We've been doing this for 20 years and more. So we have promise and we have problems. We want to say from the very beginning, as we know, religions have tremendous problems. But if we look at the large numbers of people, these traditions I study in Asia, there's over 1 billion Confucians. There's over 1 billion Hindus. There are 1 billion Muslims. There are 1 billion Catholics, and altogether 2 billion Christians on the planet, which is why Laudato Si is such a critical document. And Bill McKibben, one of the great environmentalists in this country, says Laudato Si is the most important document of the 21st century. And if you check out how many books he's read, written, and blurbed, this is an amazing statement. So we're getting people from the environmental community saying, yes, religions matter. And I can give you all kinds of examples. But this has been scaling up over the last 40 years. For a field within education, that's what we were trying to establish by these conferences and books and so on, but also a force in the larger society. In the climate change conference out in California where I was last week, where Jerry Brown brought 4,000 people from all over the world to say we're still in on climate change. But there were many protests in the streets about, is this going to be solved by climate capitalism? What's the role of indigenous peoples? What's the health issues, which is why Jerry's work in health and your work here at Duquesne is so important. A global health is entering these discussions. The moral issues are entering these discussions. So if you keep in mind a field in academia, but a force in the larger society. Now, how did I get into this work? We all have our little bios. I went to Japan in 73, 74, and frankly, I went in after Nixon was elected for the second time, after we knew the Pentagon Papers, we knew what was happening in Vietnam and so on. I had worked on the McGovern campaign, and I said, I am leaving the country until we have another president. And 2 years later, I came out on a train station in Tokyo from a Zen retreat. The headline was, Nixon resigns, I can come home. So this was a huge discovery, though, of a vast part of the world. 2/3 of the world's peoples live in Asia. I had no preparation to speak of to deal with that. And I would say that our universities are still working on this, as Jennifer and I were discussing last night. We need more courses on all these parts of the world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, Middle East, and so on. So this was great discovery. So, of course, I began to be fascinated with the traditions of Japan. This is a Shinto shrine very near Hiroshima. I studied Buddhism, was practicing Zen Buddhism, as many people were at the time. The contemplation, again, that Jennifer called for, from this tradition in Kyoto, a 1,000-year-old city that was not destroyed in the Second World War because the art historians and others argued for its tremendous historical value. The city of Kyoto is one of the wonders of the world. And in addition to Buddhism and Shinto, the tradition of Confucianism became very interesting to me. Why? Because this is a castle in the Tokugawa period from 1700 to the 20th century. This was a closed country, but all of the provinces of Japan were run by these daimyos. You've seen the samurai movies and so on. This is the samurai period. Confucianism was the main tradition. Confucianism coming in from China, Korea, into Japan. It had an educational philosophy. It had a spiritual discipline. And it also had a political philosophy that makes China the oldest continuing civilization in the world. And this is why it's crucial that we know something about this tradition, which has influenced more people than any other tradition on the planet, because this is a 5,000-year-old tradition with huge populations. So I became fascinated with Confucianism, but I also became aware that Japan and many of these countries having wonderful sensibilities about the environment were also industrializing rapidly. This is, over 40 years ago, and I can tell you Asia was completely different than it is now. But the pollution was clear in Mount Fuji and so on. When I went to China in '85, the environment was not damaged as it is today. You can see rivers in China completely polluted. You have massive, massive problems, of course, I guess I didn't put, the air pollution. When I went, people are all on bicycles and now they're in masks. There was a film about 2 years ago, a documentary in China called Under the Globe. You can probably still Google it. 30 million people watched this. The scale of what we are facing as planetary peoples is almost inconceivable. This was done by a journalist who has science background, and she was talking about holding up her baby to the window of her apartment in Beijing, not allowing her baby to go outside because of the pollution. It is staggering what has happened in 40 years, and I have been back almost every year, especially in the last decade. So intergenerational ethics have got to be thought about for the whole globe, but they've got to be differentiated for the culture and religion of these regions. They're not going to look like a Christian or Jewish environmental ethics in China or in India. So in 1995, John Grimm, my husband, who's a specialist in indigenous traditions, we said, we're not scientists, we're not policy people, how can we contribute to our growing environmental crisis? So we had a sabbatical at Harvard and we said, let's gather people from the different world religions who are specialists, and let's begin to examine the ethics that are there in the Western traditions, Asian traditions, and indigenous traditions. So this is the Center for the Study of World Religions. Out of 3 years, we did 10 conferences and 10 volumes. The Japanese Shinto one is in Japanese. But this was an effort that 800 scholars came to. We had public events and then engaged papers events just for the scholars. It was an extraordinary experience for those of you who love the power of academia to bring the best of knowledge for transformative change. It was an amazing experience. We founded, as was mentioned, the Forum on Religion and Ecology 20 years ago. We brought it to Yale in 2006. We have a huge research website which may be hopeful and helpful for the kinds of things you may do here at Duquesne in the future. Annotated bibliographies of all the world's religion, sacred texts identify statements by religious leader, and engaged projects along the lines of what Sarah was calling for. So we've documented engaged projects. The Christian one probably has 200 engaged projects. Interfaith Power and Light would be one example of that. We also have a whole section on climate science, ethics, news articles, and so on. And a forum newsletter that comes out once a month. You can sign up for it. We have educational resources of syllabi and so on. This newsletter that I've just mentioned goes out around the world. We have online classes at Yale on this topic that we're trying to make into MOOCs, massive open online classes. We have online classes for Journey of the Universe. There are about 22,000 people watching this. So interest is growing in this area. And the really good news is next generation students at Yale are very, very engaged with this, and especially people helping us with the online classes. So we have a joint program at Yale, as was mentioned, between the Environmental Studies School and Divinity School. But just last year, the Divinity School initiated its own master's in religion and ecology. And 2 years ago, those of you interested in the job situation, 7 jobs were available in religion and ecology across the country, including Santa Barbara, Dartmouth, St. Olaf's, and so on. So people recognize. We were brought to Yale by one of the greatest environmentalists, Gus Speth, who founded NRDC, founded World Resources Institute, was head of UN Development Program. And he said in 40 years of doing environmental work, in law and policy and science, we don't have the moral force. We don't have the ethics. We don't have this cultural differentiation. And as a 60s person, when I saw in the civil rights movement the religious community, religious leader and lay people, Jewish and Christian and others, come on board and say segregation, separate but equal, is no longer acceptable, and a new moral energy poured forth into our thinking here in the US. And I was in college in Washington, D.C., very involved in these demonstrations and so on, against the Vietnam War, but pro-civil rights. This was a transformative moment, and that's why this ethical force is so powerful, and it's why it's so great that people like Paul Srivastava, major world leader on this, understands this power as well. It's not going to be solved just by technology or even business, but we need this moral force. So we did this book, Ecology and Religion, and what I'm going to speak about specifically is a chapter in this book on China and Confucianism. There's lots of outreach which we can talk about. The Parliament of World Religions is meeting in Toronto in just a few weeks in November. They have about 10,000 people who come to that. Major sessions now on climate change, environment, and so on. We did a film of stories of America's religious environmentalism, which I make available to Dan. Interfaith Power and Light is one of these forces on the ground that I've mentioned. The People's Climate March in New York, I don't know if anybody from here got there, but 10,000 of the 400,000 were religious communities. It was the watershed moment when this moral force was very evident. And at the Cathedral of St. John the Divine that night, a celebration with thousands of people for this moral force. We've got the head of the Episcopal Church, the former presiding bishop, a scientist, and so on, who testified before Congress on this. This is a leader in the evangelical communities who's doing this work. The Dalai Lama, we know, has been speaking for decades on the importance of Buddhism and the environment. The Tibetan Buddhist, who's the 17th Karmapa, he came to Yale a few years ago. He has hundreds, he has actually millions of followers even in China. It's a phenomenon that's incredible. But he has 55 monasteries in the Himalaya region dealing with climate change. And if you don't think the Himalaya region is one of the most endangered in the world, with glaciers melting, with the rivers down in the subcontinent of India being affected by this, with damming going on and so on, it's one of the most critical areas of our planet. And he is working on preparing Buddhist leaders along these lines. Now, I'm coming to the China part. Du Weiming is a great scholar, but also a world-class spokesperson on Confucianism and on China. He was at Harvard when we did our conferences there. He was a huge help to us. He's one of these people who has helped to make Confucianism understood to a broader public audience. And his work is especially helping us all to understand Confucianism is not just a political system, and it's not just an authoritative system that keeps people in their places or is no good for women, etc., which, by the way, my view is that all of the world's religions have been problematic about women. So Catholics, you can relax a little bit, but we have a lot of work to do, and we all have work to do in that area. But he has particularly helped us to understand why this tradition matters for our modern world. So he has gone back to China. He's head in Beijing of an institute called the Advanced Studies Institute at Beijing University, their premier university. And he's been having conferences for the last 7 years that we've been going to in Hunan province at this Songyung Academy, which is the great academy of the Neo-Confucian scholars of the Sung dynasty in the 11th, 12th century. Now this sounds, I'm sure, way back there, but this tradition from 11th and 12th century right down to the 20th century is what guided China, what gave it its civil service exam system, its political philosophy, its educational system, and so on. So this Sung Academy is absolutely critical to the history. But let me also say something about the province where this is. It's way over in the west. It's the Yellow River Valley civilization where China began, probably over 5,000 years ago. But today it is a province of 90 million people. 90 million people. That's a third of our population, almost. The scale of China is just staggering. But here, what happened about 3 or 4 years ago, the governor of this province and all of his ministers came to this conference, you see, to say, how can we take our tradition of Confucianism and the values of Confucianism and operational, I don't even like that word, but make it practical, pragmatic, make it helpful along the lines of this wonderful question about how do you take guilt into a systemic way and the shaming and so on. But here are the politicians, what I'm trying to get across, of China, who are trying to take their tradition and put it into a moral force for environmental concerns. Because that, under the dome, the realization you cannot live in many of these cities. And there are well over 30 cities with well over 1 million people on the North American continent if we have 12 cities of over 1 million people. You see, the population is staggering. And we're talking about many of these cities with 30 million people. What are you going to do here? What's equity? What's care for people who are wanting to participate in an industrial progress mindset? You see? I don't have the answers, by the way, but I am trying to say values need to be put in place to think about this, to answer these questions. Now, I'm not going to touch on the encyclical. I'm going to stop here with the slides because you've done work here on the encyclical and so on. But let me just say a few words before I go into some part of my paper. I won't do the whole paper. So Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism are the major traditions of China. Now, Confucianism and Taoism are the indigenous traditions of China, as I'm sure you know. Buddhism came in from India, and you've got a whole variety of Buddhist sects, S-E-C-T-S, in China, including Zen Buddhism, or called Chan. But I want to just focus on Confucianism because of its critical nature. And I'll say in the paper, Du Weiming calls it a DNA. It's a cultural DNA. It's what makes for human relations. And as I say, I'm going to get into this more specifically in one moment. But let me just preface all of this by saying what's happening with Confucianism in China. Specifically, I've just given you an example of a provincial government entering into discussions of how Confucian ethics matter. And by the way, the Minister for the Environment at this conference says, we need a circular economy, no waste economy. Imagine almost any politician saying that here in the US. It'd be incredible. You know, we're talking about recycling and so on. They have to talk about recycling because there's no place to put this waste. The same in India and so on. So China and India are going to change the face of the planet. They already are. Our tar sands oil, even our fracked oil, a lot of it's going to China. We've got to put this into the equation of what we are thinking about, okay? To say nothing of what's happening in Africa with China and building infrastructure and so on and so forth. It's imperialism on steroids, although it is also bringing some good. So it's a very mixed situation. But the government, so China almost destroyed its tradition of Confucianism. How many are you aware of this? Who was the person who destroyed it mostly? Mao, right? So Mao came into power in 1949. He had to get rid of a tradition that was so dominant and so controlling in the mindset of society and politics and education. So it was almost wiped out. Again, there's no tradition on the planet that I'm aware of that systematically almost destroyed its tradition. And this is what's so interesting about what's happening now. And by the way, that began well before Mao, because in 1911, there was a huge uproar about, in 1919, the Versailles Treaty. Students were very upset with Japan getting territory, the Shandong Peninsula, in the Versailles Treaty after World War I. They felt Confucianism, their tradition was not up to world power and politics and so on. So there's a May 4th revolution of students. There was this sense Confucianism is feudal, is backward, is not able to move into modernity. So this conflict of modernity and tradition, they came up with a phrase, Western technology, Eastern morality, trying to keep their own traditions going. But all through the 20th century, this was a very rocky road. So this is why it is so fascinating that the destruction that Mao wrought through the Cultural Revolution for 10 years of destruction of intellectuals, sending them out to the countryside and so on, destruction of libraries, of temples, and this included Buddhism, but Confucianism was the real target of it. suffering such as we cannot imagine, especially of the intellectuals and academics sent to the countryside. Okay, so what's happened? China has exploded in the last 40 years with an industrial revolution we cannot even imagine. Consumption on steroids. When I lived in Japan for 3 years, over a number of years, there's tremendous consumption there. China is like unbelievable. So there's a spiritual vacuum in China that is remarkable. Young people who stay in their apartments just play games. It's happened in China and Japan and other parts of the world, but this is like they don't want to deal with the larger society. There's a high suicide rate in Korea, in China, etc., of young people. A true spiritual vacuum. So, on 3 levels, this revival of Confucianism is taking place. A government level, where Xi Jinping says we need to have our own tradition for a moral base for our society. Okay, so what I'm saying is 2 things. I'm going to say government, education, and the larger public. Those are my 3 points right now. So the government is saying we need this revival, but just a revival of values, but also for environmental protection and so on, and social justice. So the government has sponsored all kinds of conferences on this as well. There is a plank in the Constitution now in China to say there's a right to a healthy environment. That is incredible. We don't have that. Bolivia has a similar principle in their constitution. So the government is pushing this. There's Confucian institutes and so on, like Alliance Française, and some of this is problematic because it's a bit propagandistic at times too. But everything has its positive and negative sides, right? Okay, so the government is pushing this. Educational institutions are, philosophy departments are, can I say, bored with Marxism, or it's Maoism. It's run its course. And so there are people who are sponsoring conferences, I've been to many of them, on Confucianism and what is its modern role for human rights, for the environment, and so on. This is astounding. This would not have happened 7 and 10 years ago. So it's a new movement, a very exciting movement of intellectuals and academics and people looking for new ways forward. And the third point is the society as a whole. So in other words, is this just top-down, university or politics? No. A university professor, Yu Dan is her name. She's a sociologist and a journalist. She wrote a book on the Analects that was a commentary on Confucian Analects. She was on TV with this as well. This book has sold 10 million copies. See the scale of these things? 10 million copies, because people are looking for what are my values as a Chinese, and so on. So I'm saying that and turning then to some parts of this paper. And as I say, I've probably put out a lot already, but I want to just illustrate at the beginning here one more point of government interest in this. Okay? So let me share this, even though I don't really like to read papers. I like to engage more, but let me just read this first part anyway. It was a steaming hot summer day in Beijing as my husband, John Grimm, and I made our way in and out of meetings with scholars and teachers, deans and directors. All of them professed interest in the environment, even as we were surrounded by the intense air pollution of Beijing. By mid-afternoon, we found ourselves at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences talking with scholars who had read the Harvard volumes on religion and ecology. Indeed, not only had they read them, they had assembled a team of scholars and over a period of several years had translated the volumes on Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism into Chinese. Such remarkable dedication to such detailed work. It's really difficult to translate these volumes. But because they are living in one of the most polluted countries on the planet, they wanted to do this and bring these values back in. So rapid economic growth and unregulated development has caused an explosion of construction in cities and across the countryside. Most building cranes in the world are in China. You come into a city and you see cities the size of Pittsburgh and Detroit and Milwaukee outside the major cities. That's how big this is the largest urban migration in human history, and they're imagining 20 million more in the next 2 decades moving into cities from the countryside. You see, under Mao, it was prohibited to move into the cities, but now they're moving in for jobs and so on. So migrant workers have streamed into the cities, providing cheap labor in the factories. Thousands of coal-fired plants have sprung up, spewing out particulates, even though the central government has tried to stop them from being built and is now trying to shut them down. But it's sometimes impossible in regions far away from Beijing. The relentless search for energy resulted in the building of the Yangtze River Dam that took years to build, uprooted over 1 million people, and flooded ancient archaeological sites. The environmental problems surrounding the dam building were such that even the World Bank withdrew funding. Other dams are causing similar problems, as we know. In the midst of these pressing realities, the Chinese Academy of Social Science, their largest think tank, has indicated an interest in environmental perspectives and ethics from the 3 religious traditions of China, Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. Thus, they've translated these volumes, and several professors have developed their own philosophies using Western philosophy and Asian philosophy for a new environmental ethics. And by the way, this academy has a center for an Institute for World Religions with 90 researchers. 90 researchers. There's nothing like that in the Western world. The Center for the Study of World Religions has changing researchers and so on. But there's a real interest there in all of the world's religions. So at the end of the discussions there, as we were preparing to leave and face the searing heat, brutal heat, we went to check email, and there was a message there that we had hoped for but dared not assume that we would receive. It came this way: come to the Environmental Ministry office tomorrow morning at 10:30. The Deputy Vice Minister, Pan Yue, will meet with you then. We were overwhelmed and elated with the opportunity. The Vice Minister for the Environment was just returning from Sichuan, where this massive earthquake had just occurred. Later, it was reported that one of the causes of the earthquake may have been the massive size and weight of the concrete dams in the Yangtze River. And that's been on the front page of the New York Times, so that's not just conjecture. The Vice Minister was just arriving back in Beijing that night, and our plane to Japan was leaving at 2 the next day. We had just enough time for the meeting, which extended to a full hour. So we went there with a translator, with a friend who's a Taoist scholar, and another Western scholar. We exchanged gifts and so on. Much to our surprise, this high-level minister was writing about the need for ecological culture in China based on Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism. We were fascinated, as this has been one of our major aspirations, actually, and inspirations for the Harvard conferences. How do we create ecological culture here and elsewhere? Okay, ecological culture. And they're calling it ecological civilization in China. So this cultural sensitivity was necessary to be attentive to the emergence of plural forms of environmental ethics. So when we began to read Pan Yue's speeches way before we met him, we were amazed. With great care and deliberation, he had gone back to read the Chinese texts, the classics. He wanted to study this tradition and its historical development. There he found a broad understanding of views of nature that were embedded in Chinese culture, understanding, and practice. His research was remarkable and brought forth fruit in his thought-provoking essays. As he described in our meeting, he was calling for the creation of an ecological culture for China and an ecological civilization for the planet. As he explained, he says, we have environmental laws on the books, but we can't enforce them because we don't have an ecological culture. This is true here. Before this administration, even, we could not enforce our Clean Air, Water Acts, and so on, because we don't have this moral force or a sensibility for an ecological culture. And to Sarah's point, of course people have guilt because there's a profound sense. I would suggest that people realize we are at a tipping point, we are at a breaking point here in the West and in China. This is why the boundaries that Paul referred to last night, these planetary boundaries, people, even if they haven't seen that chart, they understand we're at a critical moment. We've even had to sue the EPA in this country to enforce these laws. Okay, so he says, as he became increasingly aware of how much we appreciated his cultural perspective, he threw back his head and laughed, saying, well, if you came to China to speak with someone about cultural traditions and ecology, you've come to the right guy. He was really quite elated because he's dealing with bureaucrats and autocrats and people who think this is going to be solved in a very mechanistic way. He even said he had just met with Lester Brown, who's one of our great environmental leaders and policy people. He said, even Lester doesn't get the cultural perspective here. So let me move to say, I'll give you a little feel for why such a high-level official and other government officials and people on the ground and academics are coming back to this tradition. And I want to say again, it's a tradition with problems. I'm not trying to idealize it. But let me just describe a little bit about what it is. Confucianism has conventionally been described as a humanistic tradition focusing on rules and responsibility of humans to family, society, and government. Thus, Confucianism is identified usually primarily as an ethical or political system of thought with an anthropocentric focus. However, upon further examination and as more translations become available, this narrow perspective needs to be expanded. So what I'm saying is, everybody says Confucianism, they think of ethics or they think of politics. And what I'm suggesting, along with many colleagues who've been working on this, it's much larger. Confucianism is actually being appreciated as a profoundly religious tradition in ways that are different from Western traditions. This may eventually result in the expansion of our idea of what's religion. It's not just Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Moreover, Confucianism is being recognized as a tradition for the affirmation of relationality not only between and among humans, but also with humans, the natural world, and the cosmos itself. It's one of the most important parts of this tradition. So it's a concentric circle model of the human at the middle, family, society, education, politics, nature, and the cosmos. So this tradition has been called anthropocosmic, to put the human into this large sensibility. This is what science is telling us. This is what an evolutionary perspective is telling us. It's why we did Journey of the Universe. So this cosmological orientation is realized in the connection of the microcosm of the self to the macrocosm of the universe through grounding oneself in a communitarian ethics. There's a lot of people talking about communitarian ethics, but again, this is on a very large scale, not just humans, not just not just a land ethic, and earth ethics, and even a cosmic ethic. And this is why I want to have a huge shout out to Dan Scheid's book that includes a cosmological ethics, and I highly recommend it. Ethics for a Common Good, right? An extraordinary book where he treats a number of the world's religions, but also Thomas Berry and this cosmological perspective. So, Okay, so Confucianism has been described as a cultural DNA of Chinese society by Du Ming. He suggests that this is the reason for its survival down to the present despite persecution under Mao. So Confucianism lives on within the family, involves relationships of individuals to others, and while family relations are primary for parents, grandparents, and one's ancestors, this is all the heart of life. There's incense for the ancestors every morning, and so on. And by the way, this is true, though, for most traditional societies. A communion of saints, the livingness of the ancestors, visiting graves, and so on. Lineage, a sense of lineage. And it's why Confucianism is driven by family dynamics and education. And you've got to get education for your children. So filial piety is an indispensable part of the obligations of children towards those who have given them life, nurtured them in their early years, and supported them toward adulthood. The same sense of filiality, filial piety to your parents is extended in the Confucian tradition to what's called the Great Triad, and that is heaven, earth, and humans. Or you can say cosmos, earth, and humans. That's their trinity. And what they're saying, and this is what kept me alive in graduate school, doing translations and very detailed work, is that all of this, the cosmos and the earth, are the life communities that give us life, and therefore we have a responsibility for care for the whole of creation, so to speak. So this is a very powerful source of cosmological and earth ethics and human ethics. And the Book of Rituals, Sarah ended her talk on rituals. This is a society that is hugely ritualistically oriented because the idea is ritual carries us through a life. Now, I'm going to end in just a few moments so we can have some discussion, but these complex social relations and an emphasis on harmony are still evident in China as well as across East Asia, because Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan are all influenced by this tradition. And the value of education is very, very clear. Okay. So let me just jump to the very end of this paper. Confucians were mindful that nature was the basis of a stable society and that without tending nature carefully, imbalance would result. There are numerous passages in Mencius, one of the early texts, advocating humane government based on appropriate management of natural resources and family practices. And there are various passages in Confucian texts urging humans not to wantonly cut down trees or kill animals needlessly. However, the establishment of humane society, government, and culture inevitably results in the use of nature for housing, production, and governance. In this sense, Confucians might be seen as pragmatic social ecologists rather than deep ecologists who recognize the necessity of forming human institutions, both education and political, for a stable society. Nonetheless, it is clear that for Confucians, human cultural values and practices are grounded in nature, part of its structure, and thus humans are dependent on nature for its beneficence. In addition, the agricultural base of Confucian societies has always been recognized as essential for the political and social well-being of the country. Humans prosper by living within nature's boundaries and are refreshed by its beauty, restored by its seasons, and fulfilled by its rhythms. For Confucians, human flourishing is thus dependent on fostering nature in its variety and abundance. Going against nature's processes is self-destructive. Human moral growth means cultivating one's desires not to interfere with nature, but to be in accord with the great Tao of nature. Thus, the human mind expands in relation to the mind of the Tao, the mind of the way. In short, for Confucians, harmony with nature is essential, and that human self-realization is achieved in relation to and in harmony with nature. This great triad of Confucianism, namely heaven, earth, and human, signifies this understanding that humans can only attain their full humanity in relationship to both heaven and earth. This became a foundation for a cosmological ethical system of relationality applicable to the spheres of family, society, politics, nature, and the cosmos itself. Thank you very much for listening to that large explanation of a great tradition.
Thank you, Dr. Tucker, for a very insightful presentation. I have had the privilege of attending a few academic presentations and conferences on religion and environment, and especially heard a lot about the contributions to the environment that the religions of Buddhism, Shintoism, Hinduism, Jainism, of Asia make to sustaining environmental, ecological society. But this is actually my first time to listen to an academic presentation that dwells on Confucianism from its religious perspective, and I commend you for that, because your paper appreciates and upholds the primary religious values of Confucianism and how that could help to sustain our environment. I am particularly intrigued by your clear demonstration of the role of morality, ethics, and spirituality of Confucianism in its appreciation of nature. I'm as well intrigued by the triad of heaven, earth, and humans. It is easy to see the impact of Taoism in the ideology of Neo-Confucianism, as Confucianism explores and grows, and what you call New Confucianism as well, leading to its embrace of the ideology of flowing in harmony with nature, what the Taoists call Wu Wei, the Wu Wei theology. It is also quite apparent from your positing of Confucianism that it is explicitly a socio-political minded religious phenomenon, which strongly advocates social order, which is anchored vibrantly on the sense of morality and moral responsibility. You succinctly articulated the anthropo-cosmic spirituality of Confucianism, and that wrestles seriously with a dominant anthropocentric Western religious approach to the ecology. Of course, according to you, you said human is viewed as a microcosm in relation to the macrocosm of the universe, which is a very deep and clear statement there. You vividly also related the religious undertone and the origin of Confucianism, which needs to be further amplified, not just in this circle, but beyond, because as we all know, communists embraced and even hijacked Confucianism, and has since Maoism jeopardized its religious significance, not only in China, but in other parts of the world, and Asia in particular. I hope voices with messages like yours will reverberate across China and other parts of the world where Confucian influence has been stripped of its religious significance. We, as a world, definitely need a sustainable ecological culture, not only in China, but across the rest of the world. However, this cannot be achieved by excluding religion, which is a fundamental phenomenon of all humans. Therefore, the government of China and all governments on the globe need to be inclusive of all religions. And I want to highlight inclusive. And that means all religions, not just cherry picking on particular religion, because every religion has something it can contribute to sustaining our environment. Interestingly, the religions that we tend to marginalize, the indigenous religions or the religions with lower demographics, oftentimes have more healthy and more sustainable ideologies of how to protect the environment. So we hope that our we will be able to create a sustainable global ethics for the environment. Thank you for your presentation. We have some time for interaction, so let's take Q&A. Yes.
And while the microphone's coming, I just wanted to mention, because I didn't read enough of my paper, but thank you very much for those comments. Education in a Confucian context is not just about getting jobs. It's about a moral education where the human is contributing to the larger common good. And it's why a communitarian ideal is very, very important. So education is ideally, in a Confucian sense, about cultivating the human you could be a civil servant. And a lot of it was to be a political help to the country, but you can do it through a variety of ways. I also just wanted to underscore, I forgot to mention, the revival of Confucianism is also due to those immigrants, refugees who came to Hong Kong and Taiwan after Mao took over and established incredible studies of Confucianism. And we're not talking about more than maybe 20 people. So it was kept alive by a very thin but dedicated level of academics, and they called themselves New Confucians. Du Weiming is one of them. He studied with some of them. And it's an extraordinary story in world history, philosophy, and religion, really. Please.
Yeah, given the material in your talk, it somewhat begs the question, at least to me, essentially, why is China such a basket case?
Yeah.
I mean, as Paul pointed out, there's really only three things that count in the environment: soil, water, and air. The majority of China's watersheds are polluted. Hundreds of rivers are dry. Tremendous soil loss from erosion, trace metal pollution. We all know about the air pollution. And they're exporting this essentially massive degradation of the land to Africa and Asia, where more rainforests and farmlands being plowed under for soybean than wheat and corn crops in the entire world combined. It's again, it's really a basket case. How do you reconcile?
Yeah, I should have also said more about that at the very beginning. It's such a key question. And I am suggesting, that's why I say the problems of religion and the promise of religion, and each one of these, as was said about Africa, I mean, where's Christianity been on these issues, you know? Until the encyclical and a few eco-theologians. So we can say that in many cases about most of the world's religions, they have not been actively engaged until fairly recently. But more to your point, we could answer this in a number of ways. You know, Mao kept the lid on industrial development. Deng Xiaoping started it up. When I was in graduate school in Columbia, we were like shocked to realize these economic zones along the coast off of Hong Kong were beginning to move forward. And then that literally leapt into what we all anticipated in Asian studies was going to be the most massive industrial revolution on the planet. And it is. And India's, you know, very close, slightly behind in certain ways, but very, very close. What were they following? What is the American dream? What is it that we have put forward of progress and prosperity? More stuff. So they have taken up the American dream and certain visions of imperialism that they were subject to by the various powers and gone on steroids. So I'm not excusing or I'm not blaming or shaming or whatever, but I am saying the American dream, which is in its last gasp, you might say, at this present moment, it's a dying dream because it's not a dream of inclusivity or equity or fairness for people or the planet. And that is why we need new stories of engagement. And we need limits to growth, which is what Paul brought up last night. So both China and India look at us and say, why shouldn't we do this? You've done it, you see? And Africa, the same way. So we have very serious moral issues. And my suggestion is not that Confucianism is going to stop this tragedy, but I am suggesting that we in the West have got to start paying attention to what is happening that's very negative, and hopefully encourage some of the restraints on this in collaboration with Chinese who care about these issues. So thank you for your question. It's hugely important, and we've got to think about it more. Yeah, thank you.
Someone there.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary Evelyn. It's always invigorating to hear your talks, and I'm intrigued by it because China in some ways holds so much promise. It's probably the only place on earth throughout our human history that has put food on the table for 1 billion people. Mm-hmm. And it has done it under a communist regime, at the same time becoming the largest capitalist nation in the world. Mm-hmm. And as it is making this transformation and controlling its communist tendencies and moving to a kind of very open state form of capitalism, my question is, what does Confucianism have to say to this form of capitalism that is emerging? Because if it can't control the excesses of capitalism that we have witnessed in the West, then it is going to succumb to some of the same ailments which were reflected in the prior question. So is there an active engagement between Confucianism and this aspiration for an eco-culture and an eco-civilization to emerge, and the decision-making that is going on now largely in the private sector, because many of these companies are publicly held companies playing in global marketplace?
Yeah. So, these are related questions, and as we know, if you add in both these huge corporations in China, if you add in the social media of China, and you see what it's done here in the West, just those two factors of corporations and social media, including affecting our elections, you take that 100-fold, and you have to wonder, what's going to be the answer. This is what keeps me awake at night, I can tell you. There's no question. And what it keeps a lot of people in China awake at night. These are people dedicated to a lineage that we can hardly imagine. They are dedicated to their country, coming back from abroad, from positions here in the U.S. Dui Ming is living in one of the most polluted cities in the world because he's trying to make a difference. And his colleague at some of these other universities in Beijing and elsewhere are trying to make a difference. So, and by the way, he is engaging people in the business community, but just like here, is it going to be greenwashing? Is it going to be sincere? Is it financing of cap and trade and so on? So there's a significant slice of people in China working on these issues of limits, transformation, of entering a global community. I mean, it's taken Japan a long time to become an international player. Living there in 73, 74, I was continually gaijin, foreigner, okay? There were very few foreigners in Japan at the time, and it was all about shimaguni, this island mentality. And they could do what China's doing now and ship their raw industries and mining industries abroad without any inhibitions. So again, China imitated Japan as well on these issues. So when China, and then followed by India, came on board with the agreements leading up to Paris on climate change, and John Kerry worked very carefully, as you know, with both the Chinese minister and the Indian minister, that was a huge change. We knew we had a chance to get an agreement in Paris because of the influence of China and the influence of India. That didn't happen before in the earlier agreements. So, and what's at stake right now with a trade war with China is just insane, insane. So diplomacy, where are our diplomats who understand Chinese history and language and so on, much less India and culture? We've got to use soft power. We've got to encourage these movements. And by the way, grassroots movements in India and in China against dams, for example, have been so heroic we can't even imagine. So anyway, there's on-the-ground work to be done, there's government work to be done, there's work with academics to be done.
Thank you. There's someone there.
Hi. Just kind of continuing along the string of those type of questions of what you see Confucianism may be able to talk about regarding maybe capitalist processes. One of the things that really struck me, and one of the things I've learned, is just the sociality, I guess, of Confucianism, the relationality and bringing people into relationship. But you also said something, too, that reminded me of another emerging trend in Japan and maybe in the Asian region, the trend of this intense disengagement from society. In Japan, I think they call them the herbivore men.
Yeah.
And just this idea of disengaging, not perpetuating a greed more type of lifestyle, but a disengaging from that type of lifestyle and maybe indigenous views. And so I'm curious just to see your take on how those views like that, this like intense disengagement, will engage with Confucianism going forward, this revived interest in Confucianism.
So if I'm hearing you, you're talking especially about those who've just gone back into their homes or apartments to disengage. Yeah, yeah. And that I think is a disillusionment with modernity, with rapid industrialization, to say nothing of pollution. And it's very serious. I mean, we have it in this country too, but it's on a scale there that's really kind of shocking. And I'm not sure, are you saying how can Confucianism relate to that phenomenon?
Well, I'm saying maybe relate or even offer
Oh.
somebody who is just disengaged and say, hey, Confucianism is great, let's go with it.
Okay, and I think I got the connection there, sociality or relationality. Yeah, okay. So, we have one of the highest values of individualism in the West, right? Post-French Revolution, philosophers can argue this and so on, back to Greece if you want, but individualism has been a special modern virtue, and you make it, you do your thing, kind of. So as I've mentioned, Confucianism has a very different philosophy, and of course, to some degree, we need both, but the sense of group processes, it's like, how would you win a sports game, baseball or whatever, if you're not playing as a group? So that's how Americans, when I used to teach Confucius, that's how Americans can understand this. There's stars, but there's a group play here. So I think your point, why do we have high levels of addiction, alcohol, opioids, dropoutism, in our Western society? Because again, individualism is not, much less religious traditions, is not giving people a sense of meaning or belonging, right? So, okay, so I'm going to jump out of this discussion because all the world's religions are struggling, I think, to give a level of meaning to young people who've grown up in a very, very different world. And I don't think that they're necessarily succeeding in that. I think they have potential to leapfrog into this ecological issue and draw young people in, you see. But it's also why we did this Journey of the Universe film, a series of conversations with scientists and environmentalists to say, apart from religion, we are part of this vast evolving universe, a 14 billion year universe. The elements of our body come from stars. That's why a cosmological ethics is real. We're part of the cosmos, we're part of Earth systems, a 4.6 billion year evolutionary universe. And we built in the ethics of all the world's religion. That film took 10 years to do. So there's Confucian ethics in that film. So when I show that in China and I write on the boards the characters for heaven, earth, and human, they immediately get it. When Brian gets onto the boat at the very end, we filmed in Greece, in Samos, and he says, what if we imagined ourselves as the mind and heart of heaven and earth? And that's a very Confucian idea, that we are the thinking and feeling dimension of the whole universe. We have shown that, maybe 15 times in different parts of China. Twice that film almost got onto CCTV, which is, their major central TV. The interest, this is the point of an interest in a different worldview that's inclusive. And by the way, it's been translated, the book's been translated into Chinese and Korean and Indonesian and several European languages, but the interest in China has been quite remarkable. Because of this sense, we've got to leapfrog into belonging. Where do we belong? And that's the message of that film. Yeah.
You're talking about, the tensions with religion and the materialism and how we can connect those two relationally. How do you place prosperity theology in all of that?
Okay, you mean
we have this, especially in the United States, and maybe this is a question for the previous speaker, is that, we have in the United States this heavy proliferation of prosperity theology, that God wants us to be prosperous, that he expects us to be successful, he expects us to be, to have all the material things that we want. It's not even that what we need. It's like we should have all of our wants fulfilled, and if we are true believers, we will have all of our wants fulfilled.
Right. So that's a great question. Again, it's pretty much, not exclusively probably, but that's a very American phenomenon. How did religion and prosperity, the gospel of wealth, develop? Because of our American dream, that you will be happy when you have more, when your house is bigger and better, and so on. So this is partly what I think is causing such dis-ease, even here in the States. But I think so in China has a similar notion, to be rich is glorious. And this is what, along with a Western dream, they had their own version of wealth makes everything possible. And they're some of the greatest entrepreneurs on the face of the planet, and they have been so for thousands of years. And by the way, in the Ming Dynasty, in the early 1500s, way before, almost a century before Columbus, they got all the way to the African subcontinent on ships that were way bigger than Columbus's ships. And the Ming Dynasty leaders brought them back and said, we've got to attend to our political situation in China, which was sort of a self-limitation, as my professor at Columbia takes it to be. But in other words, they had technology, they had industrial savvy, and so on for a long, long time. So I think this is part of what Thomas Berry would say, we need a new dream. We need a dream that is not just wrapped up in prosperity. It's well-being for people and the planet. It's why Laudato Si is so critical, because he's critiquing rabid materialism, rapid, unlimited industrialization, technology that's going to solve these problems. He nails it on every part of this. And he's trying to bring together a sense of human well-being with planetary well-being. So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but we need a new vision, is the bottom line, in all parts of the world. But it's a very important question. Thank you.
Okay, one more.
Thank you so much for coming today. And I do not have very much background in this. I'm a business and math major. But I found it quite enlightening. What I was wondering about is why specifically Confucianism? I know you have a lot of research in that, but why not Shintoism or any of the other religions in China as spearheading this movement? Why in particular that one? Is it because they have great tradition with it and they can relate to it more effectively? Or is it in the nature of the actual religion itself that you feel is the best effective measure?
Okay, so Shinto is Japanese. Shinto Buddhism in a Zen form and other forms in Japan. But Confucianism spans China, Korea, Japan, as I said, Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan. And that's a quarter of the world's people. So it also was the spur for the Four Tigers for rapid industrialization, because Confucian education is so important, and a contribution to a so-called common good, which we have to redefine. What is that common good? So Confucianism is a cultural DNA, as I mentioned, of the society. So even though it was destroyed, the familial relationships are so powerful. The care for ancestors and future generations is just built in to Chinese society. The sense of a civil service exam system that lasted for 900 years to create politicians who were also supposed to be contributing to a common good. So historically, it's, as I say, it's over, society's 5,000 years, but this tradition is, thousands of years old. So Taoism would be the only contender in China, but Taoism doesn't have institutional structures of education and politics that Confucianism has had, you see. By the way, I could do another talk on Taoism. Taoism and Confucianism are like a yin-yang in a certain way, okay? So it's almost like Confucianism has this responsibility to society. Taoism has more of this drop-out, be your own person, go with the flow, and they both share harmony and love of nature and so on. But Confucianism is this DNA culturally, socially, politically, educationally in China, and the historical record is just incredible. And I really want to end, I know we're going to end here, by saying, especially with these, several of your questions, China is on steroids with their own development and industrialization, but also what they are doing in Africa, especially, and in other parts of the world. And I'm not saying, yay China, and nor am I saying, yay Confucianism. These are very, very complex issues. But I am saying, against all odds, and the encyclical is against all odds too, but maybe one of our greatest hopes, is that with the power of some of these traditions to put brakes on unlimited growth, unlimited regulation, to bring us back into a sense of an earth community that we share plurality and difference and so on. And it's why Confucianism's got to be at the table, you see, for these types of discussions. So it's against great odds, but a multiform planetary earth community is emerging despite everything, I do believe. And that's where I rest some hope and possibility, and I hope you'll join with that here at Duquesne. So thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Tucker. I now invite Jerry to end the session.
Thank you very much, Mary Evelyn, for a wonderful talk, enlightening in every way. Familiar topic for many here and always new terrain for those who think they know what they already know. So thank you for letting us see it so differently. Thank you, Marinus, for facilitating the discussion. A special word of thank you to several groups. One of the speakers is leaving, so a very special word of thanks to all the speakers coming and participating together in the conversation. So thank you for all the speakers. We're about to go to lunch, and I want to make sure that we have a very special group acknowledged to be fed, the students from Central Catholic. Thank you very much again. And Mr. John Allen, their teacher, and Brother Tony for being here to inspire us all and lead us forward. So thank you very much. And one most important group of all, and that is Glory Smith, our conference coordinator. We could not do this without you, Glory, at the back of the room. Thank you ever so much. And the quiet and ever so diligent presence of our graduate students. Thank you as well, very, very much indeed. Okay. So we're going to have a lunch break now, and lunch is being served through. It's going to be a good hour or so with nice quiet time to have conversation together over table. And there's two groups at the back here. These are Dr. Scheid's graduate students who are going to be having lunch with Mary Evelyn and Sarah. So if you could just stay there just now till we get things organised for you. And so the rest of you have a lovely lunch. Lunch is served through there. Just go through and help yourself and bring it back here. All right? Thank you.